You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 34. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader. And today we have special guest, Jeb Card. Today we're talking about the Roswell excavation. Did you know that there was an archaeological excavation that was performed out at Roswell? Did you know what they found? Would you like to know? We're going to talk with Jeb Card today, and he's going to give us the lowdown on what was found out in the desert in Roswell. Get ready to think critically.
You will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. We are here with Jeb Card, champion returner of the show.
Which is, I'm not even going to say dubious. It's an award. It's good. I will take it. It's an honor.
I think you technically have been on more than Andy White has been on now.
He's been on twice. I believe this is a three-peat, which there's probably some sports metaphor I don't know. So two more and I become an ace podcast interviewee. That's what I go with. There we go. There we go. And I am absolutely bringing it on something that's going to increase my professional standing. So, all right.
Before we get on to today's topic, Jeb, would you like to give us an update on the Musestones?
Yeah, the update is I don't have an update. We are still working on them. Some equipment had to be recalibrated, and I would love to come back on when I have data, and I don't right now.
Okay, great.
So, Jeb, this is a safe place. You can admit it if you're being pressured by the government to keep quiet about the Moonstones.
Yeah.
Well, no, but if I
space on the internet.
No. At that point, I would then say, well, the Moonstones are they're weather balloons.
Yes, and test crash dummies.
Which kind of rolls into today's topic.
It does roll into today's. Today, we are talking about a very interesting topic that I didn't actually even understand existed until Ken brought it up. I didn't know there had been an archaeological dig out at Roswell.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I also thought Roswell was Area 51, which I got corrected on as well. So
yeah, we smacked you down on that one.
Yeah, on air, no less.
Yeah,
Jeb, you got what's your 60-second summary of what the claim is initially that happened in Roswell, in case anybody listening to this podcast has been
doesn't know
all right, for the last 50 years.
The legend, like the most bare bones legend, is that in early July 1947, something, probably an extraterrestrial spacecraft, crashes in somewhere in New Mexico, actually possibly several places. The people find it, and who those people are, we can talk about that. But at some point, the United States military gets involved. A press release from the Roswell Army Air Force Base, because at that time it's not the Air Force yet, or Air Corps, I forget which it is, I think it's Air Force, goes out around the world, says this, but within a day, the military says, oh no, it was just a weather balloon. But of course, what they really did was spirit it away to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base's Hangar 18, about an hour away from where I am in Ohio. And then eventually it may go to Area 51, where these things are studied and reverse engineered. And it may have had bodies, it may have had a craft, all that's various versions. And that's the basic story.
And if you've seen the movie Independence Day, is that supposed to be the UFO?
Yes.
Okay. So Will Smith can fly this
He flies the Roswell UFO.
Wait, why did they move it to Ohio?
Right, that actually is not as far-fetched as you might think. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. They call it the birth of flight because it's the Wright brothers and all that. Although they flew the thing down, but they were from there. Wright-Pat is a major Air Force base, and it is also the head of where you would have Foreign Technologies and Intelligence Command, where basically if you captured in the Cold War a MiG, like a Cuban flies like a MiG-21 into Florida, they would take it there and tear it apart to figure out how it works.
Right.
And Area 51, which is also known as Groom Lake, and it's actually, I believe it's Homey Air Force Base, is now the official declassified name of it, is on a massive dry lake bed in Nevada, north of Las Vegas. And so they would take that later. It was initially developed to fly the U-2. The U-2 was a CIA plane to sort of previous to spy satellites to spy on the Soviet Union. They tested it out there. They would then also test things like MiGs and other kinds of captured technology. So on the one level, you could think of something like the Roswell disk, if that such a thing existed, as captured foreign technology.
So it does kind of make sense that if it existed.
Right. Well, there's another level. Blue Book was centered at Wright Pat. Blue Book was the sort of last major Air Force public project on UFOs. There was an initial secret one that actually half of the people involved were like, they're not ours and they're real. That was called Project Sign. Their commander said, yeah, no. So the second project was called Project Grudge. And then finally Project Blue Book was initiated, which was sort of the public face of this. And that was out of Wright Pat. So that also would make sense.
So now, Jeb, after the first flap, all the newspaper article and everybody's all excited about it, and the Army, the military says it was just weather balloons. What happened to the Roswell story? Because it's not until really, the late 20th century that this sort of re-erupts?
Yes and no. You can say it that way when you say Roswell, but there is actually an early legends. All right, so June 24th, 1947, the term flying saucer is born, and there's like about 2 weeks of people seeing this, and they don't even necessarily tie it to aliens or anything like that. It's just like, there are these weird things. The last major part of that kind of summer panic, summer fad, whatever you want to call it, was in fact, one was captured in Roswell, New Mexico. And when that fell apart on July 9th, that kind of ended the whole initial flying saucer thing, except in the halls of power. As a public thing, people were like, whatever. That said, now, and so this sort of, if you want to talk about Roswell, that meant that the word Roswell was not associated with UFOs for another 30 years. Again, in the late 70s, a couple of UFO researchers, most famously Stanton Friedman, we can maybe talk about that a little later. I may actually tell my Stanton Friedman story. Found Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer that was sort of heavily involved in the 1947 events, interviewed him, and the story was reborn. However, there's a whole other side to it. It does appear that there was a legend of a crashed saucer with alien bodies circulating in the very late 1940s and certainly by 1950 in the American Southwest. And it was not inherently tied to Roswell. It was tied to a number of places. And it ended up getting tied, in fact, to the idea of a crash in, I think the year later, 1948, in Aztec, New Mexico, farther northwest. And this actually gets published, and I'm holding the book right now, in the first book published on flying saucers, Behind the Flying Saucers, by Frank Scully. And that's published in 1950 and 51, depending on how you're sort of measuring things. And it tells the story, and it basically tells the story as Roswell, that there is a crash disk, that there are a bunch of little bodies with like peach fuzz hair, and they otherwise look like just like little people. They don't look like gray aliens with big eyes. That changes. But it's whisked away and all that. The problem is the source for this turns out, according to mainstream history and skeptical history, and there are people who disagree with this, and we're not going to get into all that, that the source for this is a guy who ends up being a con man, that he was using his backstory of being involved in all this sci-fi whatever to sell farmers uranium and oil detectors. And so when Scully publishes, Scully was a gossip columnist. And so when he publishes this, the book sells like gangbusters. It spells the story around, but as soon as that comes out, that means that ufologists, or at that time flying saucer enthusiasts, or whatever you wanted to call them, didn't want to touch a crash story. And so while crash stories kind of continued to percolate around, nobody wanted to touch them. It was not until the late 60s and early 70s that they start to kind of percolate back out of the woodwork. And so through the 70s, this starts to, people start to tell this story, and it starts to mend and shape and move until finally, in my opinion, it gets nailed down to, Roswell. And this legend that had been kind of morphing and moving now has a place and names.
Now, in the story now, because we want to talk about the archaeology of Roswell,
Yes.
and how
Yes.
archaeology can address these issues.
In several different ways.
What are the initial claims about? Well, there will be artifacts, and artifacts in the
Yes.
strictest terms. Who's saying, well, there may be some, even though the military has secured the area and removed all of this secret stuff, who is saying, but there actually is there's physical evidence, material evidence, the kind that archaeologists rely on, out at one or more of these places in and around Roswell?
Well, early on, I mean, they initially start talking about stuff. I mean, the initial press release talks about stuff and all that. And I think this is actually really key, because so many of the claims you find in kind of pseudoscience and all that are so immaterial. And most UFO claims, of course, are very immaterial. This changed everything. And so when those stories start to become really popular, starting in the late 70s and into the 80s, this is when ufology, the people who study UFOs, was going back into a phase of what is called in the community nuts and bolts, rather than their thought forms, or they're from another dimension, or people create them with like their psychic powers. It was like, no, they're like little alien people coming in a tin can here, like they're astronauts. That became really popular again in the 1970s and 80s, and I think there's larger reasons why. But what that did is, as this became the case, as this became Roswell's big, or UFO's big everything, that kind of tied them to a falsifiable hypothesis.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So as the story develops, basically this thing crashes, and the rancher says he finds material, and the material is stuff like tinfoil and sticks. And in fact, let me actually pull up something right here. I pulled this up for this purpose. So in the story, the stuff is initially found by W.W. Mac Brazel, a rancher in central New Mexico, or sort of southwest, eastern central New Mexico, so northwest of Roswell, who finds this stuff near Corona and brings it into Roswell. And it gets described as tinfoil and that, but this is the story he says a day later. And now conspiracy theorists are all, he got like browbeaten or he got paid off.
Right, yeah.
The title is Harassed Rancher Who Located, quote, Saucer, Sorry He Told About It, which of course works perfectly for that. But he actually has a really powerful long description of the material. He describes a balloon. He describes debris, tinfoil, paper, tape. He even describes, and we'll come back to this, considerable Scotch tape and some tape with flowers printed on it. But the story that eventually becomes the legendary one comes out of Jesse Marcel and others, but he's the first one, if I remember right, who talks about, specifically with Roswell, that there are metal I-beams with hieroglyphics on them.
Right.
And that's his term and other people's term. That there is tinfoil-like material that can't be cut, that can't be burnt. And in some cases, some people say it can't be bent. In other cases, they say it can be very easily bent, but then as soon as you stop putting pressure on it, it will snap right back into the shape it had with no creases.
It's like memory metal or whatever.
Yes, that is the term. That is the term they use.
Metal.
Yeah, memory metal. And so basically, it's magical. And if I wanted to go into it, I would compare it with European ideas of fairy metals and fairy horns and fairy cups, and maybe we can get to that later. But yes, but the idea is that there is a debris field in central New Mexico strewn with this stuff. And that's what Brazel finds. And that is what the archaeological dig was looking for. Now, that said, there are numerous different versions of the story. Now, there's a book, UFO Crash at Roswell, The Genesis of a Modern Myth by Benson Saylor, Charles Ziegler, and Charles B. Moore, that looked at the various versions of the story. I think that book should have been a bit more thorough, but it's a good, solid framework of looking at how the story changed. I think they just could have done more. But it's a good, solid idea of how to handle it. And they're also maybe like, I think we've done enough on this. But basically, there are various different versions to say, all right, everybody agrees on the debris field near Corona because that was in the newspapers, that was, talked about. All the stories that emerge later are like, oh, it hit the ground there, left a big gouge, and that will become important, and then goes back in the air and skips like 50 miles and either lands near Roswell or lands on the plains of San Agustin out near Socorro and what is now the Very Large Array, or somewhere else. There's like 11 different crash sites all over New Mexico that are supposedly where this thing crashes. And some are like there's bodies here, some they're not. And again, there's all these various different stories. But all of them, their core piece is a rancher finds a bunch of weird metal and a gouge in the ground in an area near Corona, New Mexico.
Now, in all of the stories, does Brazel actually witness the crash?
No, he never witnesses it.
He doesn't. So
how would you miss that?
Why?
Well,
how is he out looking for stuff? Is that just coincidental?
So there's two elements here. Now, in later versions of this story, you do have people that don't literally witness the crash, but they see a plane coming down, they see a fire in the sky, they see all that. Right. And then in later versions, the ones that put it near Roswell, which start to appear, I don't want to be cynical, but they start to appear after Roswell starts to turn into a UFO tourist town. So the crash sites that are easily drivable from Roswell start to appear. You do what you want with that. But that said, there are those stories of like the firemen went out there and they dealt with it. But the traditional story is New Mexico's friggin' huge and it's desert. Right. And so he's out there like pushing sheep or pushing, other animals. I think it's sheep. And comes across the metal and gouge because there's not a crash saucer. It's just like, the bits on the road
it's
when you
debris,
knew
right?
Yeah, there was like a car crash and you're like, oh, look, there's some glass and look, there's a bit of a fender, and that's like all that's there. And he finds it. Now, what the story later becomes is that he didn't find it the day that he brought it in, but that he apparently found it a couple of weeks earlier, bundled some up and took it home, and then heard, oh, there's a reward out for these flying saucer things, and took some into Roswell, like the closest area to civilization. But in the original legendary thing, he finds it, and then the next day goes in and sees the sheriff.
Right. Okay. And together, don't they then bring it to the base? And
to the air. They bring it to the Air Force. Right. Yeah, or to the Army Air Force, and then the Army Air Force sends out Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer, and a counterintelligence officer by the name of Sheridan Cavett, and they go out and they collect more and bring it back, and then Marcel apparently shows his son, Jesse Marcel Jr., who did go on record later and say, I handled this stuff. And his is often considered the best testimony as to what this stuff looked like when they talk about hieroglyphs and how it handled and all of that. And then they take it, the Army Air Force Base at Roswell, which every single one of these people will constantly remind you was the only nuclear armed unit in the world at the time. I mean, they're the ones who bombed Japan. They make a big deal about that for credibility. And also for maybe why UFOs were in the area, and we can talk about that. Sure. But they put out a press release to the world that they found a crash disc, right. and then the world goes, "Oh my God!" and like the phones melt. And the next day, so they fly some of the wreckage. Marcel flies it personally. This part here does actually all. What I'm saying right now did all happen. Flies it out to Texas to General Ramey, who's in charge of Colonel Blanchard in Roswell. And that's where the weather balloon business happens. Like if you go Google all this and you see like a picture of a black and white picture of a guy holding stuff, that happens in Ramey's office in Texas. And Marcel later says, oh, the stuff they made me stand with, that wasn't the real stuff. They switched it on me. So I am pictured with a weather balloon, but that's not what I found.
But he's on record saying that?
Yes.
That's interesting. So there's this debris field, the Army. The question that we've been talking about this a little bit, Jeb. In one version of the story or several versions, when the Army is out collecting the debris, by coincidence, there's a team of archaeologists doing a survey in the area, and they're told to keep their mouths shut.
That version emerges once the story's gotten going. So that's not older. Although that said, when people start getting asked about it, a number of archaeologists even are like, I have heard that story. So, do with that what you will. But that said, now I'm about to I'm about to reference Kevin Randall. Kevin Randall is one of the big UFO, or big Roswell writers. He's probably written more about Roswell than anybody else. And I actually pulled what I'm about to say out of a number of his books, including the Roswell Encyclopedia. He runs the blog, let's see, what is it? A different perspective, and especially if we talk about another element, which we'll get to, we're definitely going to talk about his blog, because he's got some opinions on the Roswell slides. Well, we may come to, depending on time. But from his writings, he basically says that the story of a team of archaeologists that stumble across like the crash site, not the debris field, but like a ship on the ground, bodies, boom. That it comes from several different sources: an anonymous archaeologist, a nurse, this guy Cactus Jack, which is kind of like a sort of generic name for like a weird old prospector, but then eventually gets tied down to an archaeologist. And the thing is, this story comes out of this engineer by the name of Barney Barnett, who says he saw it all. And and a lot of the stories about the plains of San Agustin come from that. That's the farther west crash site. Now, I'm just going to spoil the lead right here. Randall eventually gets rid of Barney Barnett because Barney Barnett's wife eventually found his diary and is like, he is accounted for during these days.
All right.
So this stuff, and he never, his stuff's even secondhand. People are like, oh, Barney Barnett told me this. And he probably did tell them that, who knows? But his diary is like, yeah, he wasn't like cavorting around with UFOs or archaeologists during any of this time period. He's accounted for. So this is one of the things in UFO Crash at Roswell, Genesis of a Modern Myth, the folklore book, that they point out is a witness will introduce something like a funerary home with little bodies or archaeologists at the crash site. That witness will then get debunked, but too late. Now it's part of the legend,
right? Okay,
and like somebody else will like be filled in to fill that void. And so Randall kind of did go looking at this, and so even though Randall throws out Barney Barnett, he still believes there's an archaeologist involved, and it must have been closer to Roswell than on the plains of San Agustin. Stanton Friedman's all about the plains of San Agustin. Randall's all about closer to Roswell. Again, I'm just going to leave that alone.
Okay.
So Randall goes.
Hang on.
Okay.
We'll pick up where Randall was doing as soon as we get back from break.
Sure.
So hold that thought.
Archaeology and Ale is a free monthly talk presented by Archaeology in the City from the University of Sheffield Archaeology Department. That's where the archaeology part of Archaeology and Ale comes from. As for the ale part, the talk is held upstairs at the Red Deer, a great local pub on Pitt Street in Sheffield, South Yorkshire, on the last Thursday of every month. If you're in Sheffield, do come along, and don't worry, non-ale alternatives are also available. If you can't make it to Sheffield, never fear. You can listen to the Archaeology and Ale talk every month, right here on the Archaeology Podcast Network. And now, back to the show.
And we are back, and we are with Jeb Card, and we are talking about UFO archaeology. And what was Randall doing?
All right, so Kevin Randall, who is one of the chroniclers of the Roswell story, legend, history, cover-up, whatever you want to call it, was tracking down this archaeologist. And the thing is, Randall himself says in his own books that the story came in from a guy that he later doesn't believe. But he thinks that basically the story is still out there. So he goes looking, and he actually runs into one of the people that he and Thomas Carey, who we're going to get back to, put him on the trail, is none other than George Agogino. George Agogino I'm writing about him a little.
Right.
He's
well-known
awesome. Yeah, he's a well-known archaeologist. Went looking, was part of an expedition to go looking for the Yeti, and also did spy stuff. So he's like a triple threat.
Oh my God.
But anyway, so he had heard this story and he helped. But anyway, in the 1990s, these various Roswell ufologists eventually settle on W. Curry Holden, who was an amateur or a semi-amateur. He was a historian, but he had an interest in archaeology. And they sort of try to figure out that he had taken students into New Mexico at this. And there's some other like links like, oh, he met with the guy who told this story, or the relative of the descendant of the guy who told the story. He met with him at a meeting in Albuquerque in December that year. And I'm like, that proves nothing. But he actually went and interviewed Holden. And Randall asked Holden 3 different times, were you there? Were you involved? And Holden said each time, yes, I saw it all.
Oh, okay.
Except one of the things is that he was 96 years old, and a number of his family members, and Randall says this, he thinks that this is not the case, but Randall does know the number of his family members say, actually, he gets confused and maybe he was trying to please you. And do with that what you will. Holden's dead. Randall does. I mean, I will read it to you. I want to be very clear on this, actually. It's a very short little bit. I am pulling up the Roswell Encyclopedia by Randall, the archaeologist's entry. Here we go. The big question was, okay, according to him, Curry Holden, yes, at one time chairman of the Department of History and Anthropology at Texas Tech. I am paraphrasing. 96-year-old when he was discovered, Holden in 1992 and interviewed, said that he had been there. He could remember nothing specific about the event other than that he had been there and had seen it all. Each time the question was asked during the short meeting, he confirmed that he had seen it all. That he had seen the crash flying saucer, had seen the bodies of the alien flight crew killed in the crash, and had been escorted from the scene by the military officers. Later, both his wife and daughter said that he was easily confused. Memories from his life were jumbled and reordered, and he had never mentioned to either one that he had been involved in a flying saucer crash. But Holden had been asked the question 3 separate times in 3 separate ways, giving him the opportunity to answer it differently, yet he always responded that he had been there. And I am not saying anything else about that quote.
The thing that frightens me, Jeb, is that there actually is an encyclopedia of the Roswell crash.
Well,
that's kind of amazing.
There's so much lore. I mean, actually, that's given that it is a legend, is given part of like American folk science, whatever culture. I don't know, but that is Randall's quote on his interview.
So we've established now that there ostensibly there was physical evidence of this.
Well, if this happened, there should be physical evidence.
Right, exactly. So now there's a long tradition in archaeology of approaching what I think we can call historical mysteries, or things that are in recent history that have not that need clarification. For example, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Doug Scott's a well-known archaeologist in the Northern Plains, who has done archaeology at the Custer battlefield and has shown that there's physical evidence that can be used to better understand what happened during Custer's last stand, the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
And if I recall correctly, the victor's account was far more accurate.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. In fact, there were no eyewitnesses on the losing side of that. They were all dead, and so the only people who were interviewed, in fact, were the Native Americans.
Well, but there had been like these various versions of the Last Stand that had sort of.
They were, that's a really interesting report. We should talk about that sometime.
It's great stuff. We can get Scott on the show. But anyhow, so there's a tradition in archaeology of doing that. So if somebody were to have said back in whenever the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, hey, you know what? If this actually happened, there should be physical evidence, and archaeologists have the skill set for actually looking for and recovering this kind of evidence. When was that first articulated?
I don't know when it was first articulated. I do know that in the 1980s, when the ufologists like Friedman and Randall and Schmidt and others started, one of the things they were very interested in was like, did anybody keep any of the metal? And they would even go out to the site and talk about like, they would look around and maybe like one piece fell into like a rodent hole and then somebody would find it. Right. None of them were initially saying, let's go dig for it. But that did eventually occur at the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s. It finally actually happened.
Right. Now, at whose instigation? Do we know who said, hey, listen, let's hire some archaeologists to go look for this stuff?
Well, I know who paid for it. So what I'm holding right now is a book, the Roswell Dig Diaries, and the author is technically a Sci-Fi Channel book. Back when Sci-Fi was spelled S-C-I-F-I instead of S-Y-F-I.
So much more legitimate now that they changed the spelling.
Which including contributions from William H. Dolman, Ph.D., Thomas J. Carey, and Donald R. Schmidt, forward by the New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson. This is part of a series which I don't think went too far called Sci-Fi Declassified, and this is published in 2004.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, there's a whole bit on here, and I'd have to go reread it about like who thought it was. Oh, here we go. Actually, in the introduction. In 1989, a small band of researchers from the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies in Chicago attempted to conduct a preliminary archaeological survey of the acknowledged Brazel debris field. So they're arguing that they didn't have a lot of money or skills, but they did in fact try it. J. Allen Hynek was the astronomer who worked with Blue Book, but he became a believer, actually a believer in the extra-dimensional hypothesis for UFOs, founded this center that then funded a lot of the early research into the Roswell incident. But they say in May 1998, the two of us, Tom Carey and Don Schmidt, joined forces to continue an investigation. In 1999, we approached the University of New Mexico's Office of Contract Archaeology in Albuquerque about the feasibility of conducting a full-scale historical archaeological dig at the Foster Ranch site. And so basically they asked for it, and then they eventually in spring 2002 were approached by the Sci-Fi Channel to basically pay for it.
Gotcha.
So that's how it happened.
Right. And now, Bill Dolman, I do not know Bill. I don't know if you do, but
I do not.
He's a PhD archaeologist and ran, I guess, the CRM program.
Yeah, and he's been continued in other CRM operations since then. I went and looked up to see where he was up to. He's not at New Mexico now, from what I can tell, but he moved on to, like, I think a private firm and did various things. But yes.
But he's a legitimate, trained, experienced archaeologist.
Yes.
Get that straight.
Yes.
Now, how did they conscript other folks? I mean, obviously, an archaeological excavation like this. First of all, how long did the dig actually take?
I think you could go through. I think it was a few days. I don't know if it was. I think it may have been a week or so. I'm not certain.
Yeah, my recollection is it was maybe 6 days.
Something like that. Something on that scale.
It's an extremely narrow time frame.
Now that said, to be fair, Time Team does it in 3 days.
And CRM jobs take even less time than that.
Yeah. No, I'm going to say this straight up front. Like, the actual archaeology, because let me not bury the lead. Let me just get to the lead. They produced a report. The report is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happens with that report, and I want to talk about what goes into that report and sort of what happens to it, but, like, there's no archaeological shenanigans in the actual archaeology here.
Right. It's the context is quite strange, though. There is, for listeners of the podcast, you can actually see the Sci-Fi show. It's like an hour and a half. It's available on YouTube.
It will be linked in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. So yeah, but who does he? Are the folks who Dolman brings along on the dig, are they trained archaeologists? Are they professionals? Are they paid? Or are they volunteers? And if they're volunteers, where do they come from?
Some of them may be paid. I know a lot of them were volunteers, and I don't have this at my fingertips, but I know some of this. I know some of them were volunteers. First of all, they talk a lot about the volunteers. Secondly, some of them, I remember right, were descended from people involved, and at least one or two of the volunteers were ufologists. I believe Leslie Kane was one of them. I'd have to double check that, but I believe that's the case. She's a journalist who's written books about this. So most of the work, I think, was volunteers. And again, there are a number of archaeological projects that almost are entirely on volunteer labor. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. But we are aware of the fact, we should be alert to the fact that I don't believe many of the other folks had a lot of experience doing archaeology.
No, they gave them a crash course. Now, there were a number of technicians. They did a number of different, like, electromagnetic survey and stuff, and that was obviously contracted. I mean, those were technicians and professional. The diggers were mostly volunteers, I believe, although, again, I got the feeling there were some students, some others on it, and they were given a crash course. In fact, there was imagery in the video of them being inside the International UFO Museum and Research Center, the big museum that's attached to a very large gift shop in Roswell that used to be a movie theater. And there's imagery of them basically getting their, like, morning training or their pre-dig training before they stayed in Roswell, but they would motor out a couple hours every day to go to the dig site.
I just really appreciate the fact that you're calling it a crash course.
Oh, I did not even do that on purpose.
You used it twice, Jebs, but we're not going to hold that against you. So
and by that he means that we are.
Yes, I've recently rewatched the show. Yeah, I think one of the volunteers was like the daughter or the granddaughter of General Ramey?
She was the daughter.
The daughter. Oh, okay. So there are people who have an emotional connection to this whole deal.
Yes.
So now, but now, cipher this for me in watching the show. It may very well be that the archaeology was fine, but why is there like a Brinks security truck there at the site and armed guards?
And then they take the artifacts or humoos, as historical materials of unknown origin.
I love this term, by the way.
Yeah.
I think we need to somehow work that into every show.
Well, again, I don't know Dolman. I think he did another dig after this to kind of finish up a little more, and I think he was involved a little more in some other sci-fi stuff with them after this before he's like just went back to his normal life. I do think he was having a little fun with some of this. I mean, he was doing his job, but I think there was occasionally places where he had fun, and I think that's one. So they call any artifacts historical materials of unknown origin, which I just would call artifacts. But they've got in here, I'm holding in a copy in here, the Archaeological Testing and Remote Sensing Study Plan for Foster Ranch Impact Site. This was submitted to the Bureau of Land Management, so because they have to, there's laws. And there is a sentence in there: all recovered artifacts, both Native American and extraterrestrial, will be entered into a field specimen. I lit up smiling, and in a good way, the first time I read that, because I'm like, okay, that's kind of awesome, and sort of, it could be read in an awful way, and we may get back to that, and I certainly don't think he meant it that way. But the humoos, as he calls them, they then like deposited them in like a safety deposit area or box or something.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And because in the video, they actually, I mean, this clearly was a setup. This didn't coincidentally happen, but a car drives up and armed guards confront the people and they want photo ID. And of course, they're the official photographers from like the Sci-Fi Channel.
Yeah. And then they interview the guard. Yeah.
Oh, and it was just incredibly
the guard
strange and bizarre. But here's the deal, Jeb. I would like to see Native American and extraterrestrial included in the boilerplate of every proposal to the BLM from now on. Because you never know. There could be lots of flying saucer crashes out there. We want to cover all of our bases. So
I mean, also possibly goblins and Sasquatch, which we can talk about the Somalia another day. But that's... No, that kind of made me smile. That really did.
So okay, we're having fun, but we've got a legitimate archaeologist, and they're doing the procedures they're employing. And in the video, these guys, they're screening all of the matrix. They're using trowels. They're digging in in meter units or 2 meter units.
And they did that after electromagnetic survey and surface survey. So I mean, it is probably the best equipped phase 2 I've ever seen in my life.
And I liked that they used the magnetometer, because that was the first thing that I thought. I was like, are they going to do any kind of ground survey? I was interested in what the ground survey found, because I've seen magnetometers. I know what they can do, and I was just wondering what it did manage to do.
Well, actually, I bookmarked. Let me find the page. Yes. I'll basically look at the summary. They basically found 2 geophysical perspection technologies used at the site: electromagnetic conductivity and high resolution metal detection. We will get that. So the EMC, the conductivity, found 4 such anomalies. They were looking for a furrow. So let me just say what the things they're looking for. One, if they could find crazy hieroglyphic non-bending metal, well, then the game's over. Aliens landed in Roswell.
That still doesn't mean aliens landed in Roswell.
Well,
if you find something that no human could make, it's
not of this earth.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of getting you there.
And that's great.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
This is true.
Right.
Yeah. But the other thing they were really looking for was a gouge, because the descriptions say this thing crashed in the desert, made a gouge. Now, the skeptical answer is that this was a bunch of, not just one balloon, but a bunch of balloons dragging like tinfoil for radar reflectors.
They call them a balloon train.
Yes, and we can come back to what that is. Well, I can just say now, basically, so there were weather balloons, but then this thing would have been like a lot of weather balloons, like hundreds of feet of weather balloons in the era before satellites, used to listen in the upper atmosphere for Soviet nuclear testing with microphones on it.
Yeah, and the metal would be the radar targets so that they could track these things.
Yeah,
exactly.
But the ufologists go, well, if there is a gouge, that ain't no friggin' balloon train, because that's not going to smash the desert floor. And that's correct. If they had found a giant hole in the ground that looks like it dated to 1945 to 1950, that doesn't mean aliens, but that would be interesting.
It would at least say something crashed.
Yes, versus just scraped along.
Right,
so,
exactly.
And that's why they made such a big deal about the survey. So 4 such anomalies were detected, 2 of which are aligned with the reported furrow. Archaeological test pits were excavated in anomalies 1 and 3, and a backhoe trench was excavated across anomaly 3. No evidence of a furrow was found at either anomaly. Deposits are quite shallow, and so basically they're like, say it's the bedrock topography is acting as a moisture trap, which yields high conductivity readings for the first one. At anomaly 3, deposits were unexpectedly deep, possibly representing a bedrock depression that yielded similarly high conductivity readings. And it also had a bunch of buried animal burrows. And so they basically didn't find anything.
They didn't, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary.
Not with that. Now, what they did, and I guess this is sort of getting ahead, but might as well just say it now because it ties into this. One that they do find is this quote-unquote V-shaped anomaly that they did find, and they made a big deal about this in the show since they weren't finding like dead aliens or anything.
Right.
And so they find this anomaly. It's V-shaped. They did go back there and test it, and Dolman got all excited about when the cameras are on, but when he then tests it later, he gets a lot more calm about it. Again, he's doing his job, and I think he's under a lot of pressure with the TV cameras on. It's basically more or less, he says, and ultimately the apparent failure of the SU-13 anomaly to extend into the profile, in other words, it wasn't found in other tests in the same line, suggests that whatever its origin, the feature was in fact superficial.
So what that means for people who don't speak magnetometer is that it was real close to the surface and it wasn't very deep into the ground.
Well, it may also have been superficial to the excavation wall. There was some question of whether the backhoe trench did it, blah, blah, blah. But the thing, of course, is they used anomaly all the time on the show. Now, anomaly is the word that is used in remote sensing.
That is true.
But it sounds a lot better than thing I don't know, but probably is nothing.
Right. Yeah, that anomaly trick is actually something that is used a lot on the History Channel shows. They'll go on and on about anomalies, and it's like, no, that's really just the term we use. It doesn't mean anything special.
But what we're saying here is that there was due diligence in terms of the application of standard archaeological procedures at a well-funded archaeological survey. And I want to reiterate. I want to make sure everybody understands that both Dolman and one of the ufologists in the show both clearly said, hey, if a flying saucer crashed here, if there was a debris field here, archaeology will find the definitive evidence for that. So they were pretty clear on their expectation that if it happened, there would be physical evidence that using archaeological procedures they would be able to discover.
And since they used pretty rock solid archaeology out there, there's no reason to think that A, anybody was covering anything up, and B, that anybody was fabricating anything either.
No, I don't. That's the thing. You guys said that they were emotionally invested. Nobody seeded anything. Nobody put, none of that happened. Everything that was entirely above board. Now, what we can talk about in sort of the next section, I think, is what happens when the hypothesis is not,
disconfirmed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that as soon as we get back from break.
Jenny McNiven, host and diva of the Struggling Archaeologist's Guide to Getting Dirty, brings a witty, personal, and often musical view of archaeology. From personal experiences to just telling you about something she really loves, you'll always be informed and entertained. Listen to the Struggling Archaeologist's Guide to Getting Dirty on iTunes and Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/struggleart. Let's get back to the show.
And we are back, and Jeb, take it away, man.
So you guys had asked, well, all right, if this sort of falsifies a hypothesis, then does this mean you give up on Roswell because you couldn't find it? And the answer, of course, is no. Now, to be fair, New Mexico is very large, and the dig spot was chosen by Tom Carey and Don Schmidt based on eyewitness reports that they have collected for a very long time, for decades. And so one could say, well, maybe, they were digging in the wrong place.
That is the one thing that annoyed me in the video, was they were talking about when they were establishing the grid, they mentioned that they were setting it up based on eyewitness testimony. And I'm like, that was the only thing that bugged me. I was like, how do you set a grid up based on that?
Well, and that's the thing. That's their main part of research. So before this, almost all, there's basically three kinds of Roswell research. There's this archaeological stuff, which is the smallest part. The next largest part is the going into documents, and that's largely been Stanton Friedman, and going into Freedom of Information Act. He's not the only one, but Freedom of Information Act, old documents, they've all done it to some degree. But the bulk of it has all been interviewing eyewitnesses, right. Or people that knew people and all of that. And of course, the fact that I'm holding a book called UFO Crash at Roswell, Genesis of a Modern Myth, which is by folklorists and anthropologists, suggests the obvious answer is, well, that makes that folklore. But they would say, no, these people saw it and they've been intimidated into a cover-up, except that everybody has a story, so it's a really crap cover-up. But they did that. And so after this happened, Schmidt and Carey and others kept writing books about eyewitnesses.
Because that's all they've got.
Right. And and I get that. But if you go and you set up a test and your test fails, you should at least mention that in the future.
Right. Exactly.
And
well,
I checked.
But they're selling books, man. I mean, at some point I have to be cynical and be like, well, they know what's going to sell.
Well, I checked the next book that Carey did, and they literally briefly mentioned that they had set up a dig to kind of show how awesome they are.
Right.
And that's all it's mentioned in the book, and the rest is eyewitness stuff.
So they never mentioned the results.
Yeah, not in that. And then well, of course, it was on TV. Right. It's not like it's secret. And then they've been continuing to be involved with other things since that, including something else that kind of ties into archaeology, the now infamous quote-unquote Roswell slides affair.
Tell people what the hell that's all about, because that's just amazing.
Very briefly start at the beginning with that one, because
and now weird. I am working off my memory, and I don't know this as well as the Roswell traditional stuff, but the basic story here, as far as I understand it, is a few years ago, somebody by the name of Adam Dew, is a filmmaker, somehow gets, and I used to remember it involves a family member or something, gets his hands on a box of slides, of photographic slides, including a picture of Eisenhower and all these things, and hidden in the box, if I remember correctly. And everything I'm saying here, please, if I'm slightly off, because some of these Roswell people know all of their debate points, and I'm if I misspeak, I misspeak. Whatever. But
so basically, you're just setting me up for email is what you're telling me.
Yes. That hidden in the box were two slides of something that looks like an alien body with a blanket in a glass case. And so this group in super secret, involving Jaime Maussan, who's the big head honcho journalist of ufology in Mexico, and Carey and Schmidt and some others, some of which have since denounced this, others that have not, went and analyzed it. And this all got revealed. There was a film that was going to come out. I don't know if that's going to come out now, but this all got revealed on May 5th. And yes, that's Cinco de Mayo in Mexico City of last year. And in the run up to all this, the trailer for this came out in early 2015. And people saw, and there were all these rumors flying around in the subculture of ufology about it. And then the trailer comes out, and there's a brief shot of it, and people see it that's a mummy in a display case. And it was a super low res shot, but that got some people some of who are UFO believers, some who are skeptics, started working together. They called themselves the Roswell Slides Research Group, and they started analyzing it. This big, huge event where you either pay to go or you pay per view happens on May 5th in Mexico City called, I think it's like Believe or Be Witness or something like that. I think it's Be Witness, and Witness comes up again. And the better images are shown, and they get released online, and the high-res release gets online. And within 48 hours, the Roswell Slides group, the research group, says, we found a tool for doing photo analysis online. And there are like forensic people and all these people who are like, it's alien, it evolved in outer space. And again, here I am super paraphrasing. It's not human, blah, blah. And these guys in the Roswell Slides group within 48 hours, like, did you notice there's a plaque, like a caption plaque in the picture? We deblurred it. And it says it's like an 8-year-old boy who's from Mesa Verde, and like it was donated by so-and-so. I didn't say it's Mesa Verde, it's so-and-so. And they quickly did some research and like, oh, we know who donated it. It was found in Mesa Verde. We literally can say this is a Native American, this is indigenous remains.
Yeah. Right. And this is
from an archaeological site.
It's not the only time that the human remains excavated from at an archaeological site have been misrepresented as being something other than human.
Oh yeah, yeah, and often alien. I mean, there's the Atacama alien mummy, which is basically, I think, a prenatal or immediately postnatal child that looks alien. There's been a couple of other times where this happened, as well as non-human remains, like a monkey, which I believe, and again, this could be wrong, but I believe Masson was involved in that case because that got brought up a lot in this case. And some of the people involved have rejected this. Other people have not. And Carrie and Schmidt, who were involved, Kevin Randall, who I keep mentioning, he hates these things. And if you go to his blog, A Different Perspective, he's got blog posts like the next Not Roswell Slides chapter, or Tom Carey doubles down on the Roswell Slides, or the Roswell Slides and the Mummy's Placard, that are, even though he's a believer in the UFO crash in Roswell, are excoriatingly skeptical.
See, I can almost understand that, though. Actually, I do completely understand it. It's that whole recognizing bad evidence. I mean, when you have people that actually truly believe that there is evidence out there, they're going to be very critical of bad evidence. You will see this among creationists.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting because even though they still believe in something that's basically impossible and debunked, they're still very picky about the evidence that they will accept, which I think is kind of interesting.
Well, I mean, and that would be the best take on it, and I think that's actually probably a fair one. You could also be mean and go, well, these guys are competitors. Which, you know, they are, but I mean, I don't think that's the case here. I actually don't.
I don't think it is the case because I think it's one of those situations where Ken and I mention this every now and then on the shows. When we get evidence, we want it to be good evidence. That's why archaeologists reject a lot of stuff because it's obviously not real. So if you're going to bring me evidence and I'm going to go, woohoo, there really is Bigfoot or there really was aliens, I want that evidence to be rock solid, and I think that's the case here.
And I think there's also this effort to try to enhance my credibility by saying, listen, I'm not gullible. I'm skeptical. I still believe that the general story is true, but see, I'm like scientists. I am skeptical about these claims, but that does not disprove
and that's
general
fair.
claim.
And that's fair, yeah.
Yeah. By the way, here's what the plaque says. Mummified body of 2-year-old boy. At the time of burial, the body was clothed in a slip-over cotton shirt. Burial wrappings consisted of 3 small cotton blankets loaned by Mr. S.L. Palmer, San Francisco, California. And they figured that out. That was Palmer in part by matching some of that language. They basically started looking online and they found a report that had some of the exact same language. And they're like, this is the body. Like, this is literally the body. And I've even seen some reports online that other photos of it have been found. And I can't judge that perfectly, although it looks a heck of a lot like it.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is not even, but other people disagree. Others say various things. So, you know, do with that what you will.
Well, I know one of the number one arguments against it being human is that they can't find the body anymore.
Well, and I actually know there's some ufologists who are trying to find it. They believe that it is what it is, and they are trying to find it, just kind of like put a fine point on it.
Right.
But yes, it is from Mesa Verde. A splendid mummy was received by this is from the Mesa Verde Notes, September 1938, and discusses a mummy returned to the park by Mr. S.L. Palmer of San Francisco. A splendid mummy was received by the Park Museum recently when Mr. S.L. Palmer Jr. of San Francisco returned one that his father had taken from the ruins in 1894. The mummy is that of a 2-year-old boy. It is in an excellent state of preservation. At the time of burial, the body was clad in a slip-over cotton shirt and 3 small cotton blankets. Fragments of these are still on the mummy.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I just want people to know one of the reasons why the body probably isn't found anymore is repatriation.
Yeah, that is very likely, given that it was found at Mesa Verde. There's not any real question where it came from or who it is, and it's in good condition. Yeah, almost certainly. If it wasn't just repatriated out of decency, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, almost certainly would have gotten involved at some point. Yes.
I think it was repatriated after the passing of NAGPRA, because I believe it was returned with one of the major arguments is that it was returned with a large collection of remains and artifacts that belonged to the Native peoples there, and it was it was reburied.
Yeah. And I'm getting this, by the way, from a ufologist. I'm getting this from Alejandro Rojas, radio host for Open Minds Radio. It's on his site, openminds.tv. He just did a huge UFO conference, or a large UFO conference. And so, again, there are people in this that I don't necessarily believe a lot of what they believe, but they're like, yeah, really? So
they don't want bad evidence any more than we do.
Yeah.
Well, actually, they want it even less. But
it reflects poorly on the entire field if crazy people are making these extraordinary claims that are obviously false.
Yeah, I mean, there's the fringe, and then there's the fringe of the fringe.
Yeah.
You're always going to run into that. And there's probably the fringe of the fringe of the fringe.
My favorite take on this, and I have heard this, and since I have not literally heard it, I've only read descriptions of it, is there was a very well-known name in UFOs who wrote a book with a creepy alien on the front, and you can kind of figure out who that might be, who on his radio show or in an interview with him apparently was at least discussing plausibly the idea that maybe the alien was shown in public for reasons. And so that's what the photo is. So it is a museum, but it's actually an alien on display in the museum to screw with people. Like, I am not actually really hyperbolizing that.
It's like the movie They. Unless you have the special sunglasses, you can't see it.
I think he was literally like, well, if we put it out there, then people will realize, they'll think it's a mummy, and they'll fool people. Or who even knows? I mean, at that point, just like, stop listening.
That's the perfect example of hiding something in plain sight.
That's what he was arguing.
Exactly. So the way you hide it is by showing it in a museum. Because of course, if it were really an alien, we wouldn't be showing it in a museum, and so nobody will accept it. Because the easiest way to hide something is to destroy it entirely, or put it in those vaults that they have at the Smithsonian where all the giants are.
And make sure it doesn't look like a primate. Now, that said, so there's the fact that archaeologists were believed to be involved with this by some people. There's the fact that an archaeological dig was done. There's the fact that this whole Roswell slides business recently was basically cobbled out of indigenous people. And I think that's actually the most interesting in some ways. And we don't have time to get into this, I think, but it could actually make a really cool discussion in the future.
Yes.
I think there's a really important kind of equation of sort of deep time, and deep can be very shallow if it's not your ancestors especially, which gets back to the whole ancient aliens business of the archaeological, the science fictional, the unknown. And one of those things is not like the other. Yet it's in there. And this is one of these things that I'm kind of working on. This book, if I can ever finish it, is that equation. And again, we could possibly revisit this in the future. But I do think that this is not an isolated case. And in fact, the whole idea of a UFO crash to some degree goes back to the 19th century and kind of archaeological ideas about the past and about sort of humanity. So, I'll kind of leave that one hanging there.
I like the quote that you sent in the correspondence we were having before the show about the whole the inherent magical nature of the southwestern peoples that is just assigned to them by basically white people.
Well, there's that, yeah, and there's also.
I really appreciated that because I feel like that pretty much sums up why so many other races and cultures are used by the fringe in the ways that they're used, because it's like, well, they're inherently magical. And it's like they're just people. They're just like you and I. There's no reason to assume supernaturalness to them.
Well, and the thing we don't really have time to get into, because it just would take forever to do it, but right. I'd love to do it, is, we mentioned the hieroglyphs here. There is an incredibly long history, and with not entirely ungood reasons, of treating people that write in certain ways as that being magical writing. And the fact that all these UFO crashes, they always use that phrase, not weird writing, but hieroglyphs, I don't think is at all an accident, and I actually can kind of prove that. But that is definitely, again, a very long conversation. But I think it's the same thing. I think it's sort of they're not us. They're kind of a more mythic time and place, and so therefore, of course, they're aliens. Of course, that when they disappear into spaceships. Of course, they have deep knowledge of all these things. And we see this in pop culture. We see it in legendary. We see it in folklore. That's why, indigenous constructions become the mounds of giants. That's why, the ancient aliens thing is entirely predicated on this.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
All right, we got about 10 minutes left. Do you guys want to touch on any topics before we wrap up?
Well, before we wrap up, I think that the really important point that Jeb has made here,
yes,
kind of overarching, is that, look, whether the history we're talking about is 50 years ago or 50,000 years ago, history is not a just so story. That we have a way to test hypotheses about that history based on recovering physical evidence that informs us as to exactly what was going on. Again, whether it's 50 years ago or 5,000 years ago. But be careful what you wish for. If you're saying, hey, listen, we can assess the validity of this UFO crash story by going out there and looking for physical evidence, and when you don't find it, when in fact you come away saying there is no evidence supporting the story, you can't you're not a scientist if you just walk away from that, ignore it, and say, well, the hell with that, but we've got these eyewitnesses. That's not how this process should work anyway.
And here's the fascinating part. I actually think when you said be careful what you wish for, there are a number of these cases where once they've latched on to a blockbuster physical evidence type thing, right, it ends up it really does bite them in the ass. And this I can tell this a little shorter. I want to at some point work up an article about this, but I have this sort of scheme of how a paranormal, and using field is, I guess we have to, but I don't like that word for this necessarily, but a paranormal field kind of develops. And especially if it's one tied into the idea of science. And, a critic would say pseudoscience, but let's put that away for the moment. But the idea we're doing science rather than I'm channeling spirits.
Right.
Okay. So things like going and looking for Bigfoot or Nessie or UFOs or whatever. And the thing that's interesting is if you tie yourself to a case like this, and there are two things that happen. One, it drums up general interest dramatically. There are any number of UFO stories and even UFO close encounter stories, but the idea that this thing could be found is what made Roswell so big in the public eye.
Yeah.
And what happens is if you do that, it blows up and you get all eyes on you. The problem is if it doesn't happen, it kills you. And what happens at that point is that kills this kind of nuts and bolts, this is a physical thing that science can study. It doesn't kill the legend. It doesn't kill the idea. What it does is it turns it often kind of occult and paranormal and non-physical. And let me give you a couple examples that are very much like the Roswell one and walk through the Roswell one. So my favorite of all these is the Loch Ness Monster, Nessie.
Sure.
Which kind of rose and fell on that one photo, the surgeon's photo. Yeah, the swan-looking thing. And it kind of started to fall apart in the 1980s when they did that deep scan. They took all these boats and went across at the same time with sonar and scanned the entire loch, and they found one or two anomalies, but generally like no monster showed up.
But no
and so that began the fall of it. And when the photo fell apart because it was a physical thing and everybody latched onto it. In fact, the original legend almost fell apart in about a year, and then that photo showed up and it was like, boom, this is now a world legend. When that fell apart permanently, the legend started to really come to pieces. And when I went out to Loch Ness last year, which I shouldn't say things like that, but there's still a lot of tourism, but you can get this feel that this is not a living, breathing thing. Bigfoot, you have the same thing to some degree with the Patterson film, but since that's never been killed entirely necessarily, and that gets into all kinds of complicated nonsense. But what happens is there's this big drum up. Do you guys remember the Bigfoot in the freezer?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
It was in the Atlanta area in 2008. So CNN, and then when CNN covered it, everybody else covered it. These two guys are like, we got a Bigfoot in the freezer,
Right.
And then it turned out to be pig guts and like a rubber costume.
Right.
After that happened, Bigfoot got bigger than it had been. It got TV shows and all of that, but it got a lot more paranormal. And the same thing happened with UFOs. When Roswell broke and it kind of reached its boiling point in 97 on the 50th anniversary, the X-Files are at their height. There's like UFO movies, Independence Day, all this stuff. Like pop culture in the 90s was all about this stuff. When that became huge, and then the reports come out, oh, it's the mogul balloon and all this, ufology started to really decline. I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but I think this was a major key. And what then happened is there were some parts that went back to the ultra-dimensional and the other things, but then what really happened is Ancient Aliens kind of revived and ate UFOs alive. And so now most people who are interested in UFO stuff are actually primarily interested in either abduction and that's fallen apart for other reasons, or Ancient Aliens. And so I think that's right. There is a downside. If you create a physical, falsifiable hypothesis, good luck to you, because if you don't make it, maybe not you personally, but this field thing of yours is probably going to actually pay for it.
Well, but you say that, but then, I mean, look at Ancient Aliens and the Bigfoot thing. They have transcended the physical realm. They no longer need to exist physically. Now they are supernatural, entities.
Right. But I think
they have a television show that's been on the air for 10 years.
Right, but I think there's two components to that. One, the people that were all like, we're keeping this real, we're keeping this scientific, they get screwed.
Yes.
Like, you don't hear about like all of those people anymore, because one, they get disgusted with it, some of them, and the other, like Randall, he's all like, I'm still trying to find this real thing, and everybody else is like, sorry, son, I'm with the Ancient Aliens.
I'm communing with the aliens right now.
Well, there's that too. And so they get shunted away as not being popular. But then I think the thing that happens is on a sort of generational scale, once it goes supernatural, it loses the pop culture factor. So everybody's like, UFOs, that's like aliens coming from outer space. I can totally get behind. It's like, well, actually, it's the Pleiadians channeling in. And at that point, everybody's like, sure, whatever. Like, if Bigfoot's a big ape that like sells beef jerky, that's a thing. If he's like a forest person who can like travel through the astral plane and talks to you about his various tribes, at some point, the people that make movies and TV will stop paying attention.
There is so much about Bigfoot I don't know.
But like, I'm talking like 20, 30 years from now. I'm talking like 20, 30 years from now.
There's a delicious irony here, because in this case, the lack of any physical evidence is evidence of it being something paranormal.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So the lack of evidence, in fact, supports a hypothesis that is untestable.
But here's the model I would give you, though. Here's the model I would give you. Coddingsley fairies.
Right. Okay.
So in the 19th century,
those are fakes.
No, hang on. in the 19th century, there was a very serious like folkloric and archaeological argument by people like MacRitchie and others that fairies were actually a memory of Neolithic or Mesolithic or pre-Neolithic and Mesolithic people in Europe. Is like this kind of when prehistory was beginning to emerge in the late 19th century. They were like, all the stories are true, all the myths are true, but they're distorted euhemeristically. And fairies were big in the 19th century, both as like a spiritual thing or as maybe they were actually real. And that kind of percolated, and it culminates to some degree in the Coningsby fairy photographs. And when those became patently fake after an initial flurry of interest, then people kind of largely stopped talking about fairies. Not entirely, but see, I'm expecting that with these. Like, I'm expecting that with UFOs. It's already kind of happening. And I expect that, like, with Bigfoot, say 20, 30 years from now. I really do. Like, once you go supernatural, you start to lose the popular appeal. Because then it gets all into, like, basically being a quasi-religion for some people.
Right. Okay.
So you're right. Right now, it's still huge. But once you pull away from the science validates this to some degree, you're going to start losing a lot of the converts you would have had.
You lose the popular.
Yes.
I agree with you. You lose the popular end of it, but you still maintain the fringe side of it.
Oh, yes. It won't
and that's,
kill it. Yeah.
I mean,
No, absolutely agree. It won't kill it, but it won't be what it was.
It won't be what it was, but it'll always be there on the back burner waiting.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Some people argue it's just waiting for a way to become physical. Although I also think the whole pseudoscience and like physicality and like go study for this stuff is largely a late 20th century mid to late 20th century phenomenon that kind of reflects the rise of science. And as science starts to fall out of the public eye to some degree, you're seeing more of the spiritual side. But again, that's a big, long conversation that we've had a little in other. I think the first show I was on, we kind of talked about that.
I was going to say that's a deep conversation. I don't think we're set up for.
Yeah, no.
Well, Jeb, thank you very much. This has been
great fun, Jeb.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
This is really great. And I'm glad I found out that there was a archaeology. Okay, before we leave though, because this is killing me.
Yes.
What else did they find?
What
artifacts did they find?
They're all in a vault someplace, right?
I actually no. They analyzed them. And I'm turning to page 230 of the Roswell Dig Diaries, where there is a beautiful archaeological table of the Humoos. Table 2.
And you don't have to read like every single artifact.
Oh, no. So they found basically 28 things.
They only found 28 artifacts?
I think they found a few more. So the 28 items, materials inspected and tentatively identified as fall into 3 broad material categories: natural, including mineral and bone; apparent organic, of biological origin; and of, quote, manufactured appearance. 6 were positively identified as being natural. Another 3 were thought to be metamorphized insect larvae or reptile eggs. The remaining Humoas appear to be of manufactured materials, and pretty much there are things like shoe leather, rubber soles, bits of like melted plastic, part of a trash bag, and whatnot. And then I love this one line here, this one paragraph: possible Native American artifacts. The single item recovered, then tentatively identified by a volunteer excavator as possibly Native American, was identified by Dolman as being of natural origin. It is in fact an odd-shaped limestone pebble, entirely natural in origin. I get the feeling that was a bit of frustration with a volunteer, the way that this thing is written. Of like, no, it is not Native American. You
just give me your neat rock and
but
go
wait
away.
a minute. If there are pieces of reptile eggs, could it be the reptilians?
Could it be
fossilized? They're fossilized.
Oh,
could it be the Draconians? It may well, probably not, because they're collapsed sack-like items and maybe small reptiles. So maybe the reptile overlords are very, very small.
Yeah.
That would explain how they could fit inside human bodies.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. But no, he does. Dolman does have a full analysis, and so he's got in the table like the ID numbers, all the description and comments, and then a line: further analysis, yes, no, or question mark. And most of the yeses are things like clump of unidentified fibers, slightly curly, 15 to 20 millimeters, pale to white in color, possibly fur, probably not nylon. Or flattened clump, 10 to 15 millimeters of probably cotton or clothing thread, cotton, with an unknown substance adhering. Or you get the feel. You get
yes.
Yeah,
man-made
absolutely.
stuff.
Yeah. 2 pieces of very thin, translucent white plastic, question mark, rolled, split, and fragile, reminiscent of plastic drop cloth material.
So it's a good analysis, and it's all modern trash, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that stuff whenever you do an archaeological dig, there's that, at least like one that's supposed to be 300, 400, 500 years old. It's all like when I dig at Ciudad Vieja, there's all this stuff. We collect it, but it's obviously from like the 1970s and 80s. And there's like asbestos. And it's like,
It's all the surface shit.
Yeah, like I don't even do anything with it. Like I collect it in case anybody ever wants to do anything with it, but I don't analyze it, which is probably why I didn't find the reptilians.
Someday that stuff will actually be an artifact worth analyzing.
Which is why I keep it.
Just not today.
Very Augustus Fox Lane, Pitt Rivers, Cranbourne Chase of me.
So the rule here for the people on the fringe is if you go and actually look for physical evidence supporting your hypothesis and you don't find any, just ignore that shit and keep moving.
Just say it's transcendent and keep going.
Yeah.
There you go.
Say that the mummy is actually an alien in disguise.
Right. All right, for real though this time, Jeb, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jeb. It's been absolutely awesome. And we're going to have you back.
Episode.
We got more to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
all right, man.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jeb. Bye-bye.
As one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosoup Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
All right, yay, end of show.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly.